started. Oh. One.
Sorry,
Okay.
connected. You want one?
Do I? Yes, sure. Don't you want this? All right, thanks, Rosie. All right, let's get started with prayer. God, I thank you for the scriptures and for the words and actions of your son Jesus and how he's inspiring to us, and not just inspiring, but our teacher and our Lord. And I pray that today, as we go through a few of his words again, that you would help us apply them to our lives and live them out. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so last week we looked at Matthew chapter 5, and the verse that we memorized was Matthew 5:23 through 24. Could anyone say that or do their best at saying that out loud without looking at anything? Anyone want to give it a try? Did anybody try to memorize it? You try. That's a good thing. Did you know that it's worth trying even if you don't succeed? Because just by trying, you're getting it into your mind, into your heart, right? Even if you can't. I've memorized things and I can't repeat them now, but they're still in there, right? All right, so Dad, you want to try?
If you are presenting your gift at the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, go to him. First and leave your gift at the altar, go to him and be reconciled. No, I can't say it right now.
All right, let me give it a try. Therefore, if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, what's that? Leave your gift at the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother or sister. Then come back and offer your gift. Something like that, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't help if you know it in multiple translations because they keep inserting themselves into the text. Or if you've studied the text at length in another language, and then when you translate it yourself, you have that in your mind, and it all just gets really confusing. But you have it in your mind. I walked down the road the other day, it was a couple weeks ago, and before I preached a sermon like on the context of the sermon, or on the prayer, so that covered all of chapter 6. And I realized as I walked, I had all of chapter 6 in my mind. I could go from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. Maybe I couldn't quote it word perfect, but it's all there. So, and that's what's really important, whether you can mouth it in a service like this, it's it got into your heart. That's what's important.
So, do you have any thoughts on those verses? Yeah, Mom. Yeah, she says God must think that our relationships with one another are extremely important if we were even supposed to be at the temple, and to drop that, our duty to God, and go fix that. Other thoughts? Phil? Yeah. Yeah, Sandy. There are times when people don't get reconciled. Yeah.
As far as it depends on you, live at peace with all people, all men. That's another one where the language has changed in translations over the years. And that recognizes it's not always, it does not always depend on you.
My thought when I was meditating on this verse is that doing the right thing is often inconvenient. You know, this person's about to offer their sacrifice at the temple. Make sure you go and do the right thing first, right? And it's not easy always. I'm going to hand, Caitlin, can you hand these out for me? Oh, did everybody get one? Thanks, Rosie. Sorry, Caitlin. We're all messed up today, aren't we?
So this week we move on to the next section of the sermon. And it is not our intention to just go through the sermon. We've gotten stuck and we can't get out. We're trapped. We will get out. Our intention initially was each week you would have a command of Jesus to practice and live, and then we would talk about whether you had opportunity to do that. But we're kind of laying a foundation for that in the Sermon on the Mount. And this week we're reading verses 23 and 24, and I'm going to ask, or I'm sorry, we're reading verses
31 and 32.
31 and 32, and I'm going to have Kevin read that for us.
It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Years ago, I was preaching through the Gospel of Matthew. Not here, I was in chapter 19. In chapter 19, some Pharisees come to Jesus and say to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any or every reason? And Jesus answers them in the words of Deuteronomy 24. So I'm going to preach that passage. I got up and I said, today I'm preaching on divorce. And you could hear a pin drop. I suddenly realized people were paying way more attention than they usually do, and it made me nervous because I'm looking out there, and these are my friends. These are people I love, many of whom have been through divorce and have suffered. And now I'm going to talk, and I know what they are already expecting: condemnation. And so, when we come to this part of the text, we need to do it gently and lovingly. Jesus is tackling an issue that was a big problem in first century Israel. It's a bigger problem in 21st century America. But divorce isn't really the problem. The problem is that we don't know how to be married. And in some cases, we don't even get married. And I'm not just talking about people who cohabit. I'm talking about people who go through a ceremony, but they're not joined, which is something that isn't going to happen as God intends it to happen when people don't have the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees. I tell people often when they're getting married, you know what, as far as I can tell, you have found the right person. You have found the right guy. That won't keep you married. You have to become the right people now for the next 50 years. That will help you be married. So, in the first century, divorce was quite an issue. Let me give you a little background. The marriage relationship was different than it is now. So society was different. society was very patriarchal. Women belonged to the man, either to the man, her father, or she was then given to the man, her husband, almost like property. And women had very few rights. So it's important to note that was how culture operated. It was not how God commanded. So we can look back and say, oh, for those good old days. Those are not the good old days. In first century Israel, a man could divorce his wife for almost any reason. Now, there were two schools of thought, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And the two schools of thought differed quite a bit. One said you can only divorce for the cause of adultery, marital infidelity. The other said you can divorce for any and every reason. Some rabbis said if your wife puts too much salt on your eggs, you have the right to divorce her. It was even said that if a man sees a woman he finds more attractive, that's grounds for him to divorce his wife. So you think these things are new. They're not new. But a woman could not divorce her wife except for one of two reasons. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's our culture today too, isn't it? A woman could not divorce her husband except for one or two reasons. One of two reasons. The first one was that he had joined in one of the 7 disgusting trades. So the 7 disgusting trades made a person ceremonially unclean all the time. And being unclean could not participate in the synagogue or temple worship. And for that reason, a woman could divorce her husband. She could also divorce her husband if he became a heretic. But men could divorce their wives for almost anything. They could be unfaithful, they could be abusive, but that wife could not divorce her husband. For divorced women, so divorce is a tragedy. So you can't divorce except if he becomes a heretic or engages in one of the 7 disgusting trades. You're a woman. You can't do it. So what if he does become a heretic or engage in one of the 7 disgusting trades? You don't divorce him anyways. And you don't do it because divorce is absolutely terrible for the woman. The guy just skates on. But for the woman, it's disaster. Now, she has no way to make money. Her only hope of having any kind of life at all is getting married again. And maybe that will happen, maybe it won't. And if it does happen, she's used. She's going to be viewed that way in that culture. 2, she might find her parents will take her back into the home. But she will go back into the home as property of her father and something not much better than a slave. Or 3, she can get a job. There are 2 jobs available in this culture, taking in wash and being a prostitute. Those are the only 2 jobs that are available to a woman in this culture. So being a woman's a good way to starve. And once you realize that, you think of the woman at the well, John chapter 4. How often she's been put down by preachers through the generations, this terrible woman. She's married 5 times, and now she's living with some guy she's not married to. Well, we don't know the story, but this is entirely possible. And so Jesus says, do not judge, or you will be judged. And we're so good at judging, we don't even know when we're doing it. This woman, very possibly, had some sort of sexual dysfunction for which her husband divorced her or was unable to bear children. And so she got divorced. Her only hope is to get remarried. She gets remarried, gets divorced, gets divorced, gets divorced, gets divorced. And now she is an outcast.
That wouldn't have been her choice in the first place to get divorced, probably.
No, if her husband had been abusive and terrible, she would have stayed married to him. The husband's choice to divorce, not hers. So in that context, Jesus says, I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, commits adultery. Now, the NIV says makes her commit, the victim of adultery. That's a very difficult thing. And that's a interpretation, not a translation. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So in the first century, who could commit adultery? In this room, She could, he can't. She could, he can't. I mean, it's not that they couldn't, but rarely were they ever charged with adultery. And so men, they could just, because men could marry more than one woman. They can just take another woman into their home, and they can kick their first wife out. And so when Jesus is asked about this, he goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, where Moses, Kevin, the hour will be gone, and I won't be done with this. We're going to have trouble today. Where Moses said to men, give them a certificate of divorce. Now, you can interpret that as saying, oh, I got an out. I get in this marriage. And that, by the way, is exactly how the disciples interpreted. When they heard what Jesus said, they said, whoa, no divorce? It would be better never to get married than be in a situation where you're stuck. Oh my goodness. So Jesus said, Moses gave you this law because of the hardness of your hearts. So here's what he's thinking. The law about divorce was absolutely to protect women, because women had no protection. If they couldn't divorce, they couldn't remarry, because adultery, moving in with somebody else, could be punishable by death. So Moses gave you this law because of the hardness of your hearts. Otherwise, women are going to be absolutely destroyed in this situation. Now, there's a lot of confusion today about this. I mean, if you go to a pastor's meeting and you ask pastors, what do you think about this? They're going to come all over the board. I think that we need to stick to what Jesus actually said. And by the way, Jesus does not say, you may never divorce. Often we don't know that. We don't even notice it. What he says is that whoever divorces and then remarries, and the idea may even be divorces in order to remarry, causes this, except for the cause of marital unfaithfulness. Jesus isn't rescinding the law of Moses here. What we have to, he's not giving us a new law, thou shalt never divorce, but he is making it clear that it takes the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees to live in a marriage relationship that honors God and fulfills both partners in the couple. And if we don't have that, we're always going to be blaming the other person. And we'll be doing all the things Jesus just told us not to do. Lusting, getting angry, and condemning. And can you imagine how many divorces there would be if people all had the righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, and they didn't get angry, or they didn't get controlled by their anger, they didn't condemn, and they didn't lust? The divorce rate, which is somewhere around 50% in America, would disappear. And Jesus wants us to become those kinds of people. It's not just about, I have known people who managed to stay married their whole lives. And I wondered that they didn't kill each other. They were terrible, mean, and awful to each other. That's not what Jesus wants. He wants people whose marriage becomes a platform, a stage for the love and goodness of God. So St. Paul can say, but I am talking about Christ and his church, which is displayed in the marriage relationship. Okay, you might have something to add to that because I totally left my notes.
Well, let's just open it up. Any questions or comments that you have about this? You can ask him. No?
Just get the main thing is the righteousness of the heart. When the righteousness of the heart is present, that surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, divorce isn't a problem. But it's a huge problem when it's not.
And again, Jesus is not making new laws in this section, which is what people often get confused about. He's not making a law about divorce. like Dad said.
And here's a law about oath, and here's a law about this, which is how people come to it. And then they become very legalistic, and they think, if I did that thing, I'm okay. Jesus is concerned about who you become, not just what you do. And he's concerned about what you do because that has impact on who you become.
All right, so let's move on. This is the next section, oaths. Starting in verse 33, again, you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you've made. Where am I at? But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And
by the way, he's referring, that throne footstool thing goes back to Isaiah. Jesus is full of the Bible. And it's always coming out.
And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. When I was in high school, I had a group of friends, and we would get together and play this game called Mafia. And in this game, you're a pretend town. And there's a bad guy or bad guys called the Mafia. And your goal is to, if you're the Mafia, lie to everyone and convince them that you're not the Mafia, you're just one of the town, right? And the town tries to kill everybody.
The Mafia tries to kill.
And the Mafia tries to kill everybody else.
Everybody.
Yeah. And so I found out that I was pretty good at this game. I was good at manipulating people to my way of thinking. And I didn't show much expression on my face, and I was the quiet pastor's kid, and so everybody believed me. And
I played this game with him one night, first time I'd ever played it, and didn't know how it was played. When it was over, I was so mad at him and his brother. I'm like, where did you guys learn to lie like that?
So the more my friends and I played, right, the less people trusted me. And the better my performance was in the game, the more believable I was, the more suspicious people became of me, right? And so I kept having to step up my game, to be more and more believable and saying, interesting things and pretending I wasn't who I was. So people in the Bible would have been very good mafia players. Not because they were good liars, but because they had developed convincing ways of getting people to believe what they were saying. They took oaths a lot more often than we do. So sometimes today you'll hear people say, I cross my heart and hope to die, right? Or I swear to God that this or that, right? That's kind of like an oath. But the oaths that people in the Bible would say is, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do this or I won't do that. You remember reading that sort of thing in the Old Testament? An oath...
God is my witness.
Yeah. An oath was supposed to do two things. It calls God as a witness that they're going to fulfill it, and it suggests that God is going to punish the person if it's not fulfilled. So people thought if you used a formula when you made a promise, God would hold you to account in a stricter way because his reputation, his honor was on the line. But of course, people took advantage of that. They misused God's name in order to manipulate people into believing them, which I think is part of what the third commandment is about. Do not use the name of God in vain. So in the Old Testament, God commands people that they should follow through on their oaths. This is Deuteronomy 23. If you make a vow to the Lord, your God, do not be slow to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. Whatever your lips utter, you must be sure to do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. So, in an attempt to give reverence to God, Jews stopped using the divine name Yahweh. They called him Lord instead. And well-meaning Jews told people to leave the divine name out of their oaths and to swear by lesser things, less sacred things like heaven, the temple, the altar, the city of Jerusalem. But what do you think happened when they started leaving God's name out of their oaths. They started to not keep their oaths, right? The further they became removed from the actual name of God, the less danger they faced in violating it. And so Jewish teachers had to make decisions about which oaths were actually binding and which were not. So in the Jewish law code called the Mishnah, there's a whole tractate in it given over to the question of oaths, including a detailed consideration about whether they're binding or not. So for example, one rabbi says, if you swear by Jerusalem, it's not binding. But if you swear toward Jerusalem, your oath is binding. And Jesus brings something out like this in Matthew 23. The Pharisees would say things like, if you swore by the altar, you could get away with breaking your oath. But if you swore by the gift that's on the altar, then it's binding and you have consequences for not following through. Here's the point. Oaths became not a way to promote the truth, but a means to more effective deceit. It's not that people swore oaths intending to lie, but they wanted to use an oath to get their way without actually being held accountable for what they promised. I think that we do that often in a number of ways. We use our words, I'm not talking about we specifically, but people. We use our words to control and to influence people so that we can get our way rather than simply speaking the plain truth and letting people act as they may. What's important to us is that we get our way because of what we're saying, not that the truth be spoken. But the truth is important to God, and it should be important to us. If we left out the desire to manipulate and control others with our words, we would all be speaking a lot less. There would be a lot more silence in this world. You can trust a guy who just says how it is, can't you? He doesn't, mince words or anything. He just speaks the truth, and he doesn't say much else. You can trust somebody like that. So Jesus says, don't even take an oath. It's not that taking an oath is evil. It's not. In fact, Jesus took an oath at his trial when he was required to do so by the law.
And by the way, if you get legalistic about this, you end up saying, I'm not going to take an oath in court. The Jehovah's Witnesses do that. I will not take an oath in court. Jesus said not to take oaths. That's a new law, one that surpasses the old law and makes it even more tough on us. That's not the point.
The point is that every word which we speak is binding, whether it has an oath attached to it or not. God is a witness to every word we speak, and we're going to be held accountable on the day of judgment. Jesus says that in Matthew chapter 12. As far as God is concerned, every word we speak is as good as an oath sworn in the name of the Lord. So Jesus says, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. The point of this whole section is that Jesus' followers should be people of integrity. People who speak the truth and live it out, even when it hurts, even when it puts them in a bad light, even when it damages their cause. If we tell our kids we're going to do something, or our grandkids, we'll do it, no matter how inconvenient it might be. When we make a commitment, we follow through. We should be people whose yes is as good as a promise, and whose no is as good as a sworn oath. The righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees was not a truthful righteousness. That's the problem. The whole basis of their righteousness was to manipulate people into thinking about them in a certain way. The man or woman who has the righteousness that surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees is a truthful person of integrity. What you see is what you get. What you hear is the truth. Jesus is saying that we shouldn't use our words to manipulate people into buying what we're selling. And even if we really think that we're right and that our cause is just, we should never take advantage of the truth by manipulating people's emotion or their judgment to get what we want.
And you can do that by leaving things out. Not just what you say, but what you don't say can be just as bad. So that idea of I'm going to get you to do what I want by how I present things and sometimes distort things, that's just, Jesus' people need to be the people of truth.
Right. St. Augustine was he was an excellent rhetorical speaker, and he respected other people who could speak really well. And he came across St. Ambrose, who was preaching in public, and Augustine wasn't a Christian at the time, and he heard this man speak, and he thought, this man knows what he's talking about. But there's something that really struck him about Ambrose, which was that he wasn't trying to use his religion to get his way. He was actually speaking what he knew to be the truth, wasn't exaggerating, wasn't trying to manipulate people. And his preaching was part of what turned St. Augustine to Christ.
And by the way, this is nowhere worse off than, so I call it inflationary language. We make things bigger and greater than they ever are. And when people talk like that about their spiritual lives, when they exaggerate, make things super big, that is devastating to the effect of the gospel. People will stop listening to you. And that includes our children and our grandchildren. We don't dare use that inflationary language, which is just another aspect of let your yes be yes and your no be no.
When you say inflationary, you mean exaggerating?
Yes, I mean exaggerating, throwing in lots of adjectives to make things bigger and better, and trying to use those words to impress people in order to get them to do something. Even if that something is to trust Christ. And we've had this great falling away in America. I mean, the numbers are frightening what's happening right now with young people leaving the church. We've lost something like from over 90% of people who said they were Christians down to 68%.
63.
63%. That's in 3 decades. Well, there are reasons behind that, and one of the reasons is people have said yes who never said yes with their lives because other people convinced them they had to do it.
One of the things I notice when speaking to unbelievers, the biggest problem, one of the biggest hindrances for them to become a Christian is they don't trust other Christians. They don't trust what we say. They don't believe us when we speak. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Norm said, quoted St. Francis, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. So
Yes,
that number was for people who said that they were Christians, not people who said they attended church. So Christians should be people who are dedicated to the truth, and not just dedicated to, doctrinal truth, but to actually expressing the truth about themselves. This is who I am. Being truthful in the way they put themselves out there towards others in their image. Yeah, Jane. That's true. The truth itself has gotten warped and relative. At least that's how people think. You know, the difficult thing about the truth is that it's not flexible at all. You bend it a little bit and it breaks. And that's true with how we present ourselves as well. Manage people's perceptions of you a little bit by how you say things or when you leave something out and falsehood makes an appearance. If we were all perfectly true and all we said and all we did, we would be without sin. James says that in chapter 3. He says, anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect. They're able to keep their whole body in check. And that's why Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Everything else comes from the evil one. Yeah, Phil? What do you think it has to do with oaths in court? I have a feeling you have an idea in mind.
No, that's true, but Christians should say, I'm always in court. I can't decide I'm going to be false because you will be judged by every careless word. God's the judge. And we don't want to be people who are people of untruth. You know, when I was a kid growing up, more than once my dad said to me, your word is your bond. If you say it, you better do it. And I heard what he was saying. Today, I think things have changed dramatically. And the person who's best at working things is the one who's respected and getting what he wants. That's not supposed to be us.
So our verse to memorize this, just a second, Rob, I'll get to you. This verse, our verse to memorize this week is the let your yes be yes verse. I mean, as we're memorizing that, think about how this applies. Am I doing what I say? Are my words as good as an oath? Rob. Yeah, he says that it used to be there's two sides to every story. Now it's like there's three. There's my side, your side, and the actual truth. Yeah. You think we should move on?
Yeah, so let's look at
Well, we do have 10 minutes.
chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 38 through 42. Let me read them for us. You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. In my experience, these verses are the ones that cause people the most difficulty with the Sermon on the Mount. These people are the ones that have caused some people to say, well, the Sermon on the Mount does not apply in this age. It doesn't apply until the millennial age. And I think it's because we misunderstand these verses.
These verses are counter-cultural to us. In our culture, we've been taught to stand up for ourselves, to get back, what's owed us. And because these are so countercultural, turn the other cheek. They go in one ear, they go out the other. But if Jesus' words don't fit into our worldview, if they don't fit into our lifestyle, perhaps we need to change how we think about things and do things in order to make room for them. So Jesus says, you've heard it say, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. When Jesus instructs us not to resist an evil person, he means do not set yourself up against them to oppose them, their words or their deeds. In other words, don't pay back anger for anger, offense for offense, wrong for wrong. This is something that's repeated in the New Testament over and over again. To do not pay back wrong for wrong or evil for evil.
Yeah, but doesn't the Bible say eye for eye, tooth for tooth?
So, yes, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That is from the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 24. But that law was not meant to exact cold, swift justice, but to prevent unjust overreaction to wrongdoing. So, if someone hits you in the eye and gouges it out, you can't return the favor by cutting off their head. That's an overreaction. You give an eye for an eye. The punishment, the retaliation must fit the action.
So, yeah, this was a great step forward in justice, saying you cannot exact greater damage than was done to you to someone else. So we think of that as eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Boy, that's brutal. It was exactly the opposite. It was setting limits on punishment.
And if you've ever raised little kids, you know that they always one-up each other, right? on all their, they took my toy, so I hit them, right? That's just the way human nature is. And so that law was meant to change that. And so Jesus isn't saying eye for eye is a bad law, and I'm going to give you a better one now. He's saying that the true intention of the law is to encourage people not to seek revenge or personal satisfaction when someone does wrong to them. So he gives 4 examples of what that looks like. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. That's the first. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. That's the second one. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. That's the third. And give to the one who asks you. Don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You want to go through?
So we can say, am I doing exactly what Jesus told me to do? Think about what that means. You slapped me on the right cheek, I turned you the left cheek. And then now I've turned you the left cheek. If you slap that one, do I have to turn back the right one? Turn back the left one, turn back the... Are you going to beat me to death? Is that what Jesus wants? Or, yeah, I did. I turned the other cheek, and now I'm going to give it to you, ma'am, because you did this to me. Is that what Jesus wants? He wants us to become a certain kind of person. So we're going to look at each of these in turn. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Many people have used this to teach pacifism. And so pacifism, the belief that God never wants a Christian to be involved in war or violence of any kind, including self-defense or the defense of others. I know people who strongly believe this, and I honor that belief, but I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is referring to private retaliation, not to public order. And he is instructing his followers not to be intent on getting back their own when someone wrongs them. That's Leon Moore's. We don't turn somebody else's cheek for them. I don't say, Norm, you got to turn your other cheek. This is him becoming that kind of person, not me forcing it.
Right, the point of it is we don't fight for the sake of our own self-interest or pride.
So the slapping on the cheek, many Bible scholars say this was not a violent act. We read this, say, oh, somebody has hurt me, and this is violence. It was an insulting act. People generally don't slap people this way anymore, but they find other ways of insulting and shaming people. So in ancient Jewish culture, someone would slap you, I think, with the back of your hand, but is that right? I think with the back of the right hand to shame them in public. So It was the worst kind of affront to a person's dignity. To turn the other cheek would be to take that shaming without defending yourself or retaliating, which is something Jesus himself did when he was being interrogated. So just move that into our culture. Somebody says something against you on Facebook, what do? The thing you posted, and they tell you, oh, you're such an idiot. Do you go right back at them? That would be violating what Jesus is talking about here. We want to move it off to where it's about whether you can join the armed services or whether you can do this or that. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about our lives, where we live and what we do. I think we better stop at this point. So let's just take a moment, we'll pray, and we'll get back to this next week. But what I just said, I want you to carry that with you. This is about our lives, how we live, not just about some laws that were given a long time ago. Would you help us to internalize this, not just the words, but the ideas that Jesus himself, those ideas and images, until our lives shine for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we'll come back next week.